As you drift off to sleep tonight, we'll tell the story of one of the most fascinating people. If our stories help you relax and fall asleep, please subscribe. It would mean the world to us. And now, as you continue to relax, let's begin. Tonight's story is about Neymar. The house had finally gone quiet long after midnight. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, the lights of Paris continued glowing in pale reflections across wet streets. But inside the room, almost nothing moved. A television screen rested dark against the far wall. A pair of football boots remained near a doorway where they had been left hours earlier. The sound of distant traffic drifted faintly upward through the city, softened by rain and heavy curtains. And in the stillness that arrived only after cameras disappeared and stadiums emptied, Neymar sat awake beneath dim lighting that barely touched the edges of the room. The applause had ended earlier that night. Thousands of voices had followed him across the stadium while flashes from phones scattered through the crowd like restless stars. Commentators had repeated his name again and again beneath floodlights bright enough to erase shadows from the field entirely. But now the noise belonged to somewhere else. The hallway outside remained silent. His phone rested face down on a low table beside an untouched drink. And for a few quiet moments, there was no movement except rain sliding slowly against the windows overlooking the sleeping city below. There are certain kinds of silence that feel heavier after enormous noise. Athletes often speak about pressure in public interviews, but the pressure itself rarely appears during matches. It waits afterward. It lingers in hotel rooms, recovery sessions, airport lounges, and unfamiliar apartments where celebration fades more quickly than expected. For someone followed by millions across continents, silence can become strangely unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as though the world itself has paused briefly to watch what happens when nobody is cheering anymore. Neymar leaned back into the softness of the couch, while low music played somewhere deeper inside the house. The room carried the careful perfection of wealth gathered slowly over years of fame. Clean marble floors reflected muted light from the kitchen beyond. Expensive artwork hung quietly against pale walls. Designer jackets rested neatly across the back of a chair, yet none of it fully removed the strange stillness that sometimes arrived after matches. Success could fill a house with beautiful things, but it could not completely soften the quiet that followed performance. Outside, rain continued falling over Paris, and perhaps that was why memories returned most clearly at night. Not the loud memories people expected, not goals or trophies or packed stadiums roaring beneath television lights. Instead, the smaller moments often returned first. Narrow streets in Brazil, humid evening air drifting through open windows, the sound of footballs bouncing against concrete long after sunset, his father watching carefully from the edge of training grounds, the feeling of movement before fame arrived and transformed ordinary talent into something watched by the entire world. Before Europe, before private jets and headlines and endless cameras, before millions of strangers believed they understood him. There had once been smaller nights. In Brazil, evenings carried their own rhythm. Warm air settled over neighborhoods slowly while televisions glowed through apartment windows and distant music traveled softly between buildings. Children stayed outside later than they probably should have, chasing footballs beneath fading daylight while conversations drifted across crowded streets. The game existed everywhere there, not only inside stadiums or training academies, but in parking lots, narrow alleys, beaches, schoolyards, and open concrete spaces where worn shoes scraped endlessly against the ground. For many Brazilian children, football arrived before certainty about almost anything else, and for Neymar, it arrived early. Long before international attention surrounded him, he was simply a boy moving constantly through motion and noise, learning instinctively how to keep the ball close, while everything around him shifted unpredictably. His father, who had also played football professionally at a smaller level, noticed quickly how naturally the game settled into his son's body. Certain movements could not really be taught. Balance, improvisation, the strange ability to see spaces before they fully opened. Some talents appear slowly, others announce themselves almost immediately. By the time Neymar was still very young, People around him had already started watching more carefully during matches. Coaches noticed the ease with which he controlled the ball. Defenders struggled to predict his direction. Crowds reacted differently whenever he touched possession. Even then, before the world learned his name, attention followed him in quieter forms. But childhood rarely understands the future properly. For children, even extraordinary talent still exists beside ordinary things. School mornings, video games, family dinners, laughter drifting through small rooms late at night. The future does not fully reveal its size while someone is still young enough to run through streets without thinking about cameras or expectations, and yet certain lives begin changing earlier than others. As rain pressed softly against the windows in Paris, Neymar remained still while memories continued surfacing one after another. Santos, training sessions beneath hard sunlight, youth tournaments where spectators gathered more closely near the sidelines each week. The growing realization among adults around him that football might not simply become part of his life, it might eventually reshape the entire structure of it. Fame often begins quietly, not with stadiums, with whispers, people talking carefully after matches, scouts arriving unexpectedly, coaches making phone calls, conversations between parents late at night after children have already fallen asleep. Small decisions slowly expanding toward consequences nobody fully understands yet. At Santos FC, those consequences began growing quickly. The club already carried enormous history within Brazilian football. Legends had passed through there before, most famously Pelé, decades earlier. Expectations surrounded the badge naturally. Young players entering the system understood the weight attached to success there. But Neymar's rise through Santos felt different almost immediately, not only because of his technical ability, but because of the way audiences reacted emotionally while watching him. Some players inspire admiration, others create anticipation. People leaned forward when Neymar touched the ball. Stadiums shifted subtly with expectation. Even during ordinary league matches, there existed the possibility that something unpredictable might happen at any moment. A sudden dribble, a quick change of direction, a movement playful enough to feel almost impossible beneath professional pressure, and with excitement came visibility. Television cameras appeared more often. Reporters asked increasingly personal questions. Strangers recognized him in public spaces. The boundary between player and public figure began thinning before he was fully old enough to understand how permanent that transformation might become. Still, there were nights during those years when life remained surprisingly simple. After training sessions, exhaustion settled naturally into his body, the way it does for young athletes pushing themselves endlessly toward improvement. Meals with family still mattered. Conversations still circled around ordinary concerns. Music played loudly through rooms crowded with friends. The future remained enormous but incomplete, like a distant city visible only through heat rising off summer streets. Then Europe began waiting. The attention surrounding Neymar expanded far beyond Brazil faster than almost anyone expected. Highlights travelled internationally. Clubs watched closely from across the Atlantic. Football audiences in Spain, France, England, and beyond already discussed him before he ever played professionally there. In modern football, talent no longer develops quietly. Cameras arrive early. Expectations arrive earlier. And once expectation settles around someone, it rarely leaves completely. Back in the quiet Paris house, another song drifted softly through hidden speakers. Neymar stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen, where faint lighting glowed beneath polished cabinets. The movement felt unhurried, almost careful. Beyond the windows, rainwater gathered across balconies overlooking the city, while distant headlights moved endlessly through the streets below. Somewhere nearby, another apartment still held laughter and conversation awake long after midnight. But here, silence remained mostly uninterrupted. People often imagine fame as constant excitement. But fame contains enormous waiting. Waiting inside cars while photographers gather outside. Waiting in locker rooms before matches. Waiting through recovery periods after injuries. Waiting in hotels where curtains remain closed against crowds gathering below. Long stretches of stillness exist between moments the world actually sees. And during stillness, memory becomes louder. Perhaps that was why childhood returned so often at night. Not because the past was necessarily happier, but because it belonged to a version of life untouched by permanent observation. Before every expression could become a headline. Before strangers analysed body language through television screens. Before injuries became international news discussed endlessly by commentators who had never sat alone inside rehabilitation rooms, listening to the slow repetition of recovery exercises. Football transformed Neymar's life completely, but transformation always asks for something in return. By the time he arrived in Europe to play for FC Barcelona, the scale of attention surrounding him had become almost impossible to escape. Barcelona itself carried immense global visibility already. The club represented history, pressure, beauty, expectation, and constant scrutiny all at once. And beside players like Lionel Messi and Luis Suarez, Neymar entered one of football's brightest stages. The victories there became unforgettable for many supporters. Champions League nights beneath enormous lights, celebrations spilling across stadiums, teammates embracing after goals while cameras flashed endlessly around them. To millions watching worldwide, the life appeared almost dreamlike, talent rewarded perfectly, fame arriving beside success exactly as football mythology promised it would. But mythology rarely shows quiet rooms afterward. It does not show athletes returning home unable to fully sleep despite exhaustion. It does not show phones glowing endlessly with notifications after difficult matches. It does not show how public expectation follows someone into ordinary mornings, where coffee cools slowly beside untouched newspapers. Even joy becomes complicated when millions participate in it. Neymar carried not only his own ambitions, but the projections of fans, sponsors, journalists, clubs, nations, and entire football cultures that expected brilliance continuously. And brilliance, no matter how natural it may appear, still demands emotional energy from the person producing it. The rain outside finally began slowing. Across the city, reflections shimmered along empty streets while clouds drifted gradually away from the skyline. Neymar returned toward the large windows overlooking Paris and stood there quietly for several moments, with his hands resting inside the pockets of a loose sweatshirt. The room behind him remained beautiful in the careful way luxury often is. Soft lighting, clean silence, expensive calm. Yet something about the moment still felt unfinished, perhaps because some forms of loneliness survive even inside success. Not dramatic loneliness, not complete isolation, just the subtle distance created when a person becomes watched so constantly that ordinary quiet begins feeling rare. Fame can surround someone endlessly, while still leaving certain thoughts entirely private. And athletes especially learn to protect parts of themselves carefully. Public confidence becomes necessary. Performance requires composure. The world prefers certainty from stars it celebrates. But nighttime allows uncertainty to breathe more honestly, especially after the noise disappears. Somewhere far below, a car moved through rain-dark streets, while music faded softly from another apartment nearby. Neymar remained at the window watching the city for a little while longer, almost motionless now except for the faint reflection of his face against the glass. And beyond the silence of the room, beyond the years of goals and attention and movement across continents, there still lingered the quiet feeling that something inside him continued searching for rest, in places the world could never fully see. Morning arrived slowly over the coastline of Brazil long before fame carried his name across Europe. The air already felt warm even in early hours, heavy with salt drifting inward from the sea, while sunlight spread carefully across crowded neighbourhoods beginning to wake. Somewhere nearby, motorcycles moved through narrow streets. Radios played softly through open windows. Dogs barked briefly at passing delivery trucks before quieting again. And inside small apartments where ceiling fans pushed warm air in slow circles, children prepared for school while footballs rested near doorways waiting for afternoon. Long before stadiums and private security and international broadcasts, Neymar's world had been smaller in ways that are difficult to recover once life changes completely. Smaller streets, smaller rooms, smaller dreams perhaps. But sometimes smaller worlds hold clearer forms of happiness because nothing inside them has yet become public property. As a child, Neymar moved through days the way many Brazilian boys did, surrounded constantly by football, not as performance, not yet. At that age, football existed almost like weather, always present, always nearby. The game belonged to streets and beaches and schoolyards just as naturally as music belonged to open windows at night. The ball rarely stayed still for long. Children dribbled through uneven concrete spaces between parked cars. They improvised goals from backpacks or loose bricks. They played beneath fading evening light until voices from nearby apartments called them home one by one. And somewhere among those ordinary scenes, Neymar's relationship with movement began deepening quietly into something unusual. Certain athletes describe childhood talent as instinctive, as though the body understands before the mind fully does. For Neymar, football seemed to arrive less like a skill being learned, and more like a rhythm already waiting inside him. His balance appeared natural. His touch looked effortless, even while young. Defenders around him often reacted half a second too late, because they expected movements that never came. He improvised constantly, not with arrogance, but with the loose creativity of someone who genuinely enjoyed surprise. And perhaps enjoyment mattered more than anything else during those years, before pressure complicated everything, before every match carried consequence. In Brazil, football can change entire families. Parents understand this early. Communities understand it too. A gifted child is not viewed only as talented, but as possibility itself. Escape, stability, opportunity. The game carries emotional weight far beyond entertainment, because so many lives have already been transformed through it. Stories of poverty turning slowly towards success through football exist almost everywhere there, repeated across generations like modern folklore grounded in very real struggle. Neymar's father understood those realities deeply. He had played professionally himself, though without reaching the heights his son eventually would, and because of that, he recognized both the beauty and danger surrounding football ambition. Talent alone rarely guarantees success. Young players disappear constantly despite promise. Injuries interrupt careers before they begin. Pressure changes people. Fame complicates families. Money attracts attention that is not always kind. Yet still, when he watched his son play, something became difficult to ignore. The game slowed around him. That feeling appeared repeatedly during youth matches. Coaches standing near sidelines exchanged glances. Spectators gradually drifted closer during tournaments. Even adults, distracted by conversations nearby, eventually stopped to watch more carefully, once Neymar touched possession. He carried the rare ability to make football feel playful, while still remaining strangely precise, and because of that, attention followed naturally. But childhood attention differs from global fame. At first, it arrives warmly, encouragingly. Neighbours smile when speaking about the talented boy nearby. Local coaches recommend stronger academies. Friends celebrate goals with uncomplicated excitement. Recognition still feels connected to community rather than separation from it. During those years, evenings often ended with exhaustion settling softly into his body, after hours spent moving constantly beneath heat and sunlight. Shoes gathered dust beside doors. Television sounds drifted through small rooms while meals cooked nearby. Family conversations overlapped naturally in tight spaces where privacy barely existed, but closeness did. There is a certain intimacy to ordinary life before success enlarges everything. A simplicity difficult to explain afterward. Back in Paris many years later, Neymar walked quietly through his kitchen while coffee brewed beneath dim lighting. The city outside remained grey from lingering rain clouds, though dawn had begun touching rooftops faintly in the distance. Sleep still had not fully arrived. Sometimes after matches, rest became strangely elusive no matter how exhausted he felt physically. Athletes learn to live beside adrenaline long after competitions end. The body remains alert. The mind replays moments repeatedly. Crowds disappear from sight faster than they disappear internally. He leaned against the counter, waiting, while steam rose slowly into the quiet room. Nearby, his phone screen illuminated briefly with another notification before fading dark again. Messages arrived endlessly at all hours. Teammates, friends, media requests, advertisements, opinions from strangers scattered across continents. Modern fame allows almost no true separation anymore. The world remains only one screen away at every moment. Perhaps that was why memories of Brazil returned so clearly during quiet nights, because memory offered distance from constant visibility. Back then, the future still existed as imagination rather than responsibility. At Santos FC, however, imagination began turning real very quickly. The club itself carried enormous emotional significance within Brazilian football culture. Young players entering Santos understood immediately that history lived there. Expectations surrounded every training ground and locker room. The shadow of past greatness remained impossible to avoid, especially because of Pele's legendary connection to the club decades earlier. But Neymar's rise through Santos felt unusually rapid, even within a country accustomed to producing extraordinary talent. Highlights spread quickly through television broadcasts and early internet clips. Supporters filled stadiums not merely to watch matches, but to witness possibility unfolding in real time. His style attracted attention beyond statistics because it carried personality, joy, improvisation, a kind of fearless creativity that audiences instinctively remembered. Football can sometimes become overly mechanical at professional levels. Systems, structures, disciplined movement. But Neymar played with visible spontaneity that reminded many people of older Brazilian traditions within the sport. Football as expression rather than pure efficiency, and audiences everywhere responded emotionally to that feeling. Still, with recognition came increasing pressure beneath the surface. Young athletes rarely experience gradual fame anymore. Modern media accelerates everything. A teenager can become internationally discussed almost overnight through highlights circulating endlessly online. Praise expands rapidly, but so do expectations. Once the world decides someone extraordinary has arrived, ordinary performances no longer satisfy people for very long. Neymar was still incredibly young while carrying those growing projections around him. Reporters appeared more frequently after training. Questions became more personal. Rumours connected him to European clubs before he fully reached adulthood. Magazine covers and advertisements transformed his face into something recognisable, far beyond Santos itself. Even moments meant to feel private began attracting cameras. Yet despite all that, there were still quiet scenes hidden between the noise. Late evenings after training where fatigue softened everything. Friends laughing over music in small rooms. Family gatherings where conversations drifted naturally toward ordinary topics instead of football headlines. Car rides through familiar streets where windows stayed open against warm night air. Success had not fully separated him from normal life yet, not completely. But separation was approaching. The transition from local talent to global celebrity rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It unfolds gradually until suddenly there is no returning fully to anonymity afterward. Airports become different first, then restaurants, then neighbourhoods. People begin looking longer, phones appear more quickly in public spaces, security becomes necessary in places where freedom once felt automatic. For Neymar, those changes intensified constantly as European interest expanded, especially from Spain. Barcelona existed not merely as a football club, but as one of the sport's brightest global stages. To join them meant entering permanent visibility beside some of the most recognisable athletes on earth. The move carried enormous excitement throughout football culture, but also tremendous pressure beneath that excitement. Because talent creates expectation, and expectation never truly sleeps. In Paris, dawn finally spread pale light across the apartment windows while Neymar carried coffee toward the living room. The rain had stopped completely now. Streets below reflected soft morning colours, while the city slowly awakened beneath cloud-covered skies. Somewhere in another room, faint music still played from speakers left on during the night. He sat quietly again, and perhaps mornings after sleepless nights always carry a strange emotional honesty. The world has not fully accelerated yet. Messages remain unanswered. Schedules have not completely begun. For brief moments, life exists suspended between exhaustion and routine. Those moments often reveal memories most clearly. Barcelona had changed everything. The scale of attention there became almost impossible to describe fully to anyone who has never lived inside elite football culture. Stadiums filled with 80,000 people regularly. Cameras followed training arrivals. Every gesture became analysed through broadcasts and headlines translated into multiple languages within hours. And beside Messi especially, the spotlight intensified further. Their partnership on the field created unforgettable football for supporters around the world. Movement between them sometimes appeared almost instinctive. Quick passes, sudden acceleration. Goals arriving through combinations defenders struggled to anticipate. Alongside Luis Suarez, they formed an attacking trio remembered as one of football's most dangerous. To the outside world, it looked magical. Perhaps sometimes it truly was, but magic still requires repetition, preparation, emotional energy. Even joyful success becomes exhausting when experienced under constant observation. People often assume athletes feel only excitement during victorious years, yet winning itself creates new forms of pressure. Once supporters witness greatness, they expect continuation. Every season must equal the last. Every injury feels alarming. Every quiet period invites criticism. Public admiration can shift unpredictably between celebration and disappointment depending entirely on performance. And because Neymar played with such visible emotion, audiences projected emotions onto him constantly in return. Some adored him completely. Others criticised him relentlessly. Few remained neutral. That intensity followed him everywhere. Hotel corridors before major matches, airports crowded with photographers, recovery sessions after physical knocks accumulated across long seasons. Even dinners with friends sometimes unfolded beneath distant camera lenses waiting outside restaurants. Fame had become environmental by then, surrounding ordinary life continuously like weather impossible to escape. Still, there were nights during Barcelona years when silence briefly returned. Late after matches, inside luxury apartments overlooking sleeping cities, moments where medals and headlines rested far away in other rooms, while exhaustion settled honestly across his body. During those hours, the applause faded enough for smaller thoughts to surface again. Thoughts about home, about family, about how quickly life had transformed from childhood streets in Brazil into something almost unreal. And perhaps success always creates distance from earlier versions of ourselves. Not because success is bad, but because transformation changes the scale of everything surrounding a person. Money changes environments, attention changes relationships, visibility changes behavior, even freedom changes shape, once millions recognize your face. Neymar stared quietly through the brightening windows while morning expanded slowly across Paris. Somewhere below, traffic had begun increasing now. The city was waking properly. Soon schedules would begin again, training, meetings, interviews, movement from one obligation into another. But for a few remaining moments, silence still belonged to the room, and within that silence lingered the faint memory of a boy in Brazil, once dribbling through warm evening streets without cameras, without expectation, without knowing how enormous the world would eventually become around him. There were nights in Brazil when the electricity flickered briefly during storms, and entire neighbourhoods seemed to pause together in the darkness. Windows remained open against the heat. Rain tapped softly across rooftops made uneven by time and weather. Somewhere nearby, voices continued talking through candlelight, while radios crackled faintly back to life. And in small rooms where families gathered close against humid air, football still found its way into conversation naturally, as though the game itself belonged to daily life as permanently as rain or music. For Neymar, those years existed before the world became too loud to fully escape, before private drivers waited outside buildings, before security teams stood near hotel elevators, before strangers across continents recognized his face instantly from advertisements, broadcasts, and glowing phone screens. As a boy, movement itself seemed enough. A ball rolling across concrete, the sound of shoes scraping pavement, laughter from friends continuing long after sunset. Some childhoods contain early signs of future pressure, though children themselves rarely notice them at first. Adults do. Parents begin speaking more carefully after tournaments. Coaches make unexpected phone calls. Invitations arrive from stronger academies farther away. Small sacrifices slowly enter family life. Longer travel, stricter schedules, less ordinary time together. Gradually, what once felt like simple enjoyment begins organizing itself around possibility. For Neymar, football was becoming larger than childhood itself. Training demanded increasing seriousness as he developed through youth systems connected to Santos. Sessions grew more structured. Expectations sharpened subtly around him. Even teammates often understood they were playing beside someone different, someone carrying unusual potential toward a future none of them could fully imagine yet. Still, he remained very young, and youth possesses its own strange confidence because the future has not yet revealed its cost completely. He played with freedom then. That freedom became visible in everything: the quick dribbles, the playful movements, the willingness to attempt difficult things without hesitation. Older defenders sometimes grew frustrated because Neymar approached football less like calculation and more like instinctive expression. He trusted movement before overthinking it. Crowds loved that immediately, not only because it entertained them, but because it reminded many Brazilians of older football traditions tied deeply to creativity and joy. In Brazil, football has always carried emotional meaning beyond competition alone. It reflects identity, rhythm, improvisation, survival through beauty under pressure. And Neymar embodied those qualities naturally enough that audiences connected emotionally before his career had fully begun. Yet attention changes environments quietly over time. At first, recognition feels exciting, friendly. Local supporters asking for photographs, neighbours congratulating families after matches, coaches introducing talented players proudly to visitors from larger clubs. But eventually recognition expands beyond intimacy. The circle grows too large to remain personal. The first real signs often appear in ordinary places. Restaurants become difficult. Shopping centres attract crowds. Training sessions gather spectators unexpectedly. Even simple walks through public streets begin requiring caution. And once that shift happens, normal life rarely returns entirely. Years later in Paris, Neymar stood alone on a balcony overlooking pale morning skies, while cold air moved gently through the city below. The rain had disappeared completely now, leaving streets washed clean beneath the weak sunlight, breaking slowly through clouds. Somewhere distant, church bells echoed faintly between buildings before fading into traffic noise beginning another day. He pulled his sweatshirt tighter against the air. The balcony itself felt strangely peaceful compared to the movement constantly surrounding football life. No cameras, no crowds, just quiet rooftops stretching toward the horizon, while steam rose from coffee cooling beside him on a small glass table. Athletes often speak about discipline publicly, less often about loneliness. Not dramatic loneliness filled with sadness, but the quieter version created through constant movement and visibility. Hotels begin resembling each other after enough years. Airports blur together. Entire cities become experienced only through stadium tunnels, training grounds, and secured vehicles moving between obligations. Luxury softens many difficulties, but it cannot fully replace rootedness. Perhaps that was why memories of Brazil lingered so persistently during silent hours, because childhood carried a feeling of belonging untouched by performance. Back then, life had not yet divided itself between public identity and private exhaustion. At Santos, however, the divide began growing quickly. As Neymar entered professional football properly, expectations accelerated almost beyond normal human pacing. Brazilian media followed him relentlessly. Highlights spread internationally within hours. Rumours connected him to European giants constantly. Supporters arrived at stadiums carrying not only excitement, but hope. The belief that another global Brazilian superstar was emerging before their eyes. And perhaps he was. But becoming symbol and person simultaneously creates tension inside any life, especially a young one. The football itself remained extraordinary during those years. Neymar played with confidence that sometimes bordered on audacity, yet audiences accepted it because the skill beneath it was undeniable. Goals arrived alongside moments of improvisation that seemed almost playful despite professional pressure. Defenders struggled not only against his speed or technique, but against unpredictability itself. Football rewards structure. Neymar often disrupted structure entirely. Children copied his movements on streets across Brazil. Advertisements multiplied. Interviews became more frequent. Magazine covers transformed him gradually from promising athlete into cultural figure. Even people with little interest in football began recognizing him, and with recognition came scrutiny. Every expression analyzed, every relationship discussed publicly, every mistake amplified beyond proportion. Modern celebrity operates continuously now. There is no true off switch. Cameras may disappear physically, but online attention remains awake at all hours waiting for new material. Young athletes entering that world often adapt externally before fully processing the emotional consequences internally. Neymar learned quickly how exhausting visibility could become, yet he also learned how seductive it felt sometimes. Fame creates energy around a person, unlike anything ordinary life offers. Crowds react before words are spoken. Entire stadiums rise simultaneously from their seats. Luxury arrives effortlessly once unimaginable wealth enters daily existence. Designers, sponsors, celebrities, and global brands orbit successful athletes constantly, offering access to worlds previously hidden behind distance and privilege. For someone raised modestly, the transformation can feel surreal, perhaps even unreal. And surreal lives often struggle to feel restful at night. Back inside the apartment, sunlight now reached across polished floors in long, pale lines, while the city fully awakened beyond the windows. Neymar remained outside a little longer, watching movement increase below. Cyclists weaving through traffic, delivery vans stopping beside cafes, people hurrying toward routines entirely separate from football. There is something strangely calming about observing strangers whose days will never become headlines. Ordinary anonymity, the ability to disappear into crowds. Famous athletes lose that almost completely. When Neymar eventually moved to Paris Saint-Germain FC, the scale of attention surrounding him expanded yet again. The transfer itself became global news discussed for weeks across every sports network and newspaper imaginable. Numbers attached to the deal appeared almost unreal, transforming him not only into one of football's brightest stars, but one of its most commercially powerful figures. Paris welcomed him with enormous spectacle. Lights, photographers, crowds roaring inside the stadium during presentation ceremonies. To supporters, the move represented ambition and possibility. To media companies, it represented endless content. And to Neymar himself, perhaps it represented both opportunity and pressure arriving together once again. Because each new stage of fame demands reinvention, a player cannot remain merely talented forever. The world expects evolution constantly. Leadership, trophies, legacy. Greatness becomes measured against impossible standards once audiences decide someone extraordinary has arrived. And beneath those expectations, ordinary human exhaustion still continues quietly. Training sessions in cold rain, physical pain hidden during matches, recovery work repeated endlessly behind closed doors, sleepless nights after criticism spreads online following difficult performances. The public often sees only fragments of athletic life, the goals, celebrations, interviews, luxury clothing, expensive homes. But so much of professional football unfolds privately through repetition and fatigue, invisible to supporters watching from far away. especially during injuries. Injuries alter time for athletes. The world continues moving at full speed while injured players suddenly become still. Stadium noise disappears. Teammates travel without them. Training grounds feel different because participation turns into observation. Recovery rooms replace match-day adrenaline with quiet routines repeated hour after hour. For Neymar, injuries became recurring interruptions across important periods of his career, and injury isolation carries emotional weight beyond physical pain itself. Athletes build identity through movement, through contribution, through rhythm and competition. When injury removes those things temporarily, silence expands around them in uncomfortable ways. Thoughts become louder. Criticism online becomes harder to ignore because there are fewer distractions protecting against it. During rehabilitation periods, nights often stretched longer. Recovery schedules disrupted sleep naturally. Ice baths, medical treatments, controlled exercises repeated carefully beneath fluorescent lights. Entire days organized around gradual healing, invisible to crowds impatient for return dates. And afterward, alone inside expensive apartments or hotel rooms, there remained enormous amounts of quiet time to think. Perhaps too much. Neymar walked back inside from the balcony, while sunlight continued spreading across the room. His phone lit again with messages arriving steadily now that morning had fully begun. Training staff, friends, news updates, endless communication waiting immediately beyond temporary silence. He ignored it for a moment longer. Instead, he glanced toward the football boots still resting near the doorway from the previous night. Small traces of mud remained along the sides. The sight felt strangely ordinary despite everything surrounding his life now. Beneath fame and money and international attention, football itself still reduced eventually to simple physical objects: boots, grass, movement, fatigue. And somewhere deep beneath all the noise surrounding his career, perhaps part of him still searched quietly for the uncomplicated feeling the game once gave him as a child, moving freely through warm Brazilian evenings before the entire world began watching. By the time evening settled over Barcelona, the city often glowed like something suspended between celebration and exhaustion. Scooters moved through narrow streets beneath yellow lights. Restaurants remained crowded long after midnight, while conversations drifted outward through open doors into warm Mediterranean air. Somewhere beyond the city centre, waves touched dark shorelines softly enough to disappear beneath distant traffic and music. And high above the movement below, inside quiet apartments, protected from cameras and crowds, footballers tried to rest before matches capable of altering entire seasons. For Neymar, nights before important games rarely felt calm in the way people imagined. The body might appear relaxed outwardly, music playing softly through speakers, friends speaking quietly in another room, televisions glowing dimly against modern walls. But underneath those ordinary scenes, the mind continued moving endlessly, through possibilities not yet lived. Athletes carry future moments inside them before they happen. Missed chances, goals, crowd reactions. Pressure arrives early and waits patiently. During those Barcelona years, the scale of expectations surrounding every major match became enormous. Champions League nights especially carried a strange atmosphere impossible to fully explain unless someone has stood near that level of attention personally. Entire cities seemed emotionally suspended before kick-off. Supporters filled streets hours early, wearing club colours beneath evening light while television crews gathered outside stadiums, preparing broadcasts that millions around the world would watch simultaneously. And inside hotel rooms before those matches, silence often felt heavier than noise. Neymar sometimes sat awake later than intended, scrolling absently through his phone while lights from the city reflected faintly across windows nearby. Messages arrived constantly. Encouragement from family, tactical reminders from staff, headlines predicting brilliance or failure depending on whichever story journalists preferred that day. Modern athletes live beside endless opinion. No generation before experienced visibility quite like this. At any hour, thousands of strangers could discuss his performances instantly across glowing screens scattered through every continent. Praise arrived rapidly after victories, Criticism arrived even faster after disappointment. The emotional rhythm became unstable because public reaction never truly paused anymore. Perhaps that was why nighttime mattered so much. And because late hours occasionally offered small spaces untouched by performance. In those quiet moments before sleep, Neymar sometimes returned mentally to Brazil again. Not deliberately, but instinctively, the way memory drifts toward places where life once felt emotionally simpler. Humid streets after rain, music from distant apartments, the smell of food cooking late into the evening while televisions flickered through windows left open against the heat. Childhood memories often become sharper once adulthood grows too complicated, especially for people who leave home early. Football required constant movement from him now. Countries changed, languages shifted, seasons passed inside airports, stadiums, training grounds, and luxury apartments that never fully felt permanent no matter how beautiful they appeared. Barcelona became home in practical ways, but part of him always remained emotionally connected to somewhere warmer and noisier and smaller. The strange thing about fame is how it expands life outward, while sometimes narrowing it inward. The world opens enormously, private freedom shrinks quietly. By then, Neymar could no longer walk casually through most public places without recognition spreading quickly around him. Restaurants required planning, beaches attracted photographers, even ordinary errands became events once strangers began gathering nearby holding phones ready. And because football audiences experience players emotionally, many supporters believed they knew him personally despite never meeting him at all. They recognized hairstyles, expressions, celebrations. But recognition is not the same thing as understanding. Inside the apartment, the television remained muted while highlights from older matches played silently across the screen. Neymar leaned back against the couch, watching movements from another version of himself, younger, faster somehow, smiling after goals beneath enormous stadium lights. Athletes age strangely, not always physically first, emotionally. Years of pressure compress time differently inside professional sport. Entire careers become measured through seasons rather than ordinary milestones. One year feels endless during injury recovery, another disappears instantly beneath travel and competition. And somewhere within that strange acceleration, youth begins slipping quietly into memory. The Barcelona years held extraordinary moments, but also exhaustion invisible to supporters celebrating victories from far away. Success demands repetition. Every season begins again from zero, regardless of what happened before. Goals scored last year disappear from relevance quickly once new matches arrive demanding fresh brilliance. The public rarely allows sustained stillness around stars. Momentum must continue. Even happiness can become work when cameras remain present continuously. Neymar understood increasingly how difficult it was to separate performance from identity once fame reached certain levels. If matches went poorly, criticism expanded far beyond football itself. Pundits discussed attitude, personality, focus, discipline. Every visible emotion became interpreted publicly by people constructing narratives around someone they only partially understood. Yet despite all that noise, football itself still contained moments of genuine joy powerful enough to cut briefly through pressure. Certain goals, certain passes, the feeling of movement aligning perfectly with instinct beneath roaring crowds. Those moments kept many athletes going through everything surrounding the sport. For Neymar, creativity remained central to that feeling. He never approached football like pure labour. Even under immense pressure, some part of him still sought beauty within the game itself. Improvisation, surprise, rhythm, expression. Audiences sensed that immediately whenever he played freely. But freedom grows harder under constant observation, especially once injuries begin interrupting rhythm. Injuries create fear inside athletes, even when they refuse speaking about it publicly. Not only fear of pain, but fear of absence. Fear of losing momentum while the world continues forward without waiting. During healthy seasons, football life moves too quickly for reflection. Matches arrive constantly. Training schedules organize every day. Travel fills empty spaces before thoughts settle too deeply. injury removes that protection, suddenly there is time, too much time sometimes. Neymar experienced that isolation repeatedly during difficult periods throughout his career. Rehabilitation rooms replaced stadium tunnels. Medical staff replaced teammates. Long exercises repeated beneath clinical lighting, while supporters debated recovery timelines online, as though healing followed predictable schedules. At night during those stretches, silence deepened differently. Without matches ahead, adrenaline disappeared. Yet rest still remained difficult because uncertainty replaced routine. Athletes recovering from injuries often describe feeling disconnected from the rhythm of the sport itself, like musicians forced to watch performances from outside concert halls they once belonged to naturally. The body becomes unfamiliar during recovery. Movement requires caution instead of instinct. Confidence must rebuild slowly. And for players whose identity depends heavily on creativity and freedom, limitations can feel emotionally suffocating. Outside, Barcelona nights continued glowing beautifully regardless of private struggles unfolding behind apartment walls. Supporters still filled bars discussing tactics and lineups. Tourists photographed stadium exteriors beneath bright lights. The city moved constantly while athletes inside it carried invisible emotional weight few strangers ever fully noticed. Neymar stood eventually and walked toward the large windows overlooking distant streets below. Reflections from passing headlights moved softly across the glass while music from somewhere outside drifted faintly upward through warm air. He had achieved almost everything people dream about in football: wealth beyond imagination, global fame, historic victories, millions of admirers. Yet achievement does not remove human restlessness completely. Sometimes it magnifies it, because once external goals arrive successfully, quieter questions begin lingering underneath them at night. Questions not about trophies or headlines, but about identity beyond performance, about what remains when crowds finally disperse and cameras stop recording. Those questions rarely appear during celebrations. They wait for silence instead. Back in Paris years later, Neymar moved slowly through another sleepless morning, while memories from Barcelona floated quietly through his mind. The apartment around him remained immaculate. Expensive furniture, soft lighting, enormous windows framing the city beautifully. Yet memory kept returning not to luxury itself, but to emotional fragments attached to different places. Hotel hallways before finals, late-night recovery sessions after difficult matches, teammates laughing softly on buses after victories, phone screens glowing alone in dark rooms long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Fame creates countless photographs. Memory preserves entirely different things. The sky outside had brightened fully now. Paris traffic moved steadily beneath pale clouds while the world resumed its ordinary pace beyond the apartment. Soon there would be obligations again. Training, meetings, interviews. The constant forward movement football demanded from everyone inside it. But for a few lingering moments, Neymar remained still beside the window. And somewhere beneath the years of noise and movement and applause, there lingered the quiet feeling that the child who once played freely in Brazil still existed inside him, searching sometimes through sleepless nights for moments where the world finally became silent enough to hear him again. Paris looked different during winter recovery periods. The city lost some of its brightness then. Trees stood bare along wide streets washed repeatedly by cold rain, while daylight disappeared too early behind grey clouds drifting low above rooftops. Cafes still glowed warmly at night, and people still filled them speaking softly over coffee and wine. But outside the windows the air carried a quieter mood, as though the entire city had slowed slightly beneath the season. For injured athletes, winter can feel even longer. Training routines disappear first, then match days, then the comforting rhythm of preparation that normally keeps thought and emotion moving forward together. During one of Neymar's recovery periods in Paris, mornings often began in silence before the rest of the world fully awakened. The apartment remained dim, while pale light gathered slowly beyond enormous windows overlooking the city below. Somewhere deeper inside the building, elevators hummed faintly as neighbors started their days. But inside his rooms, time moved differently. Recovery changes the pace of everything. Instead of stadium noise, there were treatment tables. Instead of teammates beside him on the field, there were physiotherapists counting careful repetitions and quiet training facilities. Even walking could become deliberate again after certain injuries. People watching from outside often imagine rehabilitation as straightforward: rest, treatment, return. But athletes experience recovery emotionally as much as physically. Confidence shifts. Frustration builds quietly. Small setbacks feel larger because the body, once trusted completely, suddenly becomes uncertain territory, and uncertainty grows louder at night. Neymar sat alone sometimes after evening treatments, with ice wrapped carefully around aching areas, while television light flickered silently across the room. His phone remained nearby, always active with messages from friends, family, teammates, reporters, sponsors. Support arrived constantly. So did expectation. When would he return? Would he look the same physically? Could he still move with the same freedom afterward? The world asked these questions immediately because football rarely pauses emotionally for injured players. Matches continue, seasons continue, debates continue endlessly online and across television studios where analysts discuss timelines and performance as though athletes themselves are machines temporarily under repair. But recovery never feels mechanical from inside. It feels personal, painfully human, especially during quiet hours after midnight when distraction disappears. Those were the nights when Neymar sometimes walked slowly through darkened rooms, unable to fully sleep, listening to rain against windows while the city outside continued without him. Injured athletes spend enormous amounts of time watching rather than participating, watching teammates play, watching crowds celebrate, watching highlights online from stadiums they should have been inside themselves. Observation can become lonely, not because people abandon injured players. Often the opposite happens. Support surrounds them constantly. But support cannot fully remove the emotional distance created by absence. For someone whose life had always revolved around movement, stillness became difficult to trust. Football had shaped Neymar's identity since childhood. The game existed inside nearly every important memory. Streets in Brazil, youth tournaments, Santos, Barcelona, national team camps, Paris nights beneath enormous lights. Movement itself had become connected to purpose, to expression, to belonging. Injury interrupted all of that temporarily. An interruption leaves empty space behind. During recovery periods, ordinary details sometimes became strangely important. Music playing softly during treatment sessions. The smell of coffee in training facilities early in the morning before other players arrived. Conversations with medical staff repeated daily enough to feel almost familial. Rain sliding down windows while stretching exercises continued slowly inside sterile rehabilitation rooms. The world outside still saw luxury, expensive homes, designer clothing, celebrity friendships. But inside recovery, even famous athletes returned to something much simpler. The body trying quietly to heal itself one day at a time. Neymar understood by then how public narratives could shift rapidly around him depending on circumstance. During healthy stretches filled with goals and victories, admiration expanded almost endlessly. During injuries or difficult performances, criticism arrived with equal intensity. Fame rarely allows neutral space. Public opinion moves emotionally, unpredictably, often without patience. And because he expressed emotion visibly, audiences projected emotion back onto him constantly. Some supporters defended him fiercely, others doubted him relentlessly. Both sides watched him continuously. Back in Brazil, meanwhile, childhood neighborhoods still existed without changing much at all. Certain streets remained narrow and loud beneath tropical heat. Families still gathered outside during warm evenings, while football games unfolded casually beneath streetlights. Children still imagined impossible futures while dribbling between parked cars. The world there moved slower than elite football life, anchored more closely to routine and familiarity. Perhaps that contrast stayed with Neymar no matter how far success carried him away. Part of him belonged permanently to movement and spectacle now. Private jets, stadium entrances, flashing cameras, luxury brands orbiting around celebrity culture. But another part still remembered simpler rhythms clearly enough to miss them during quiet nights abroad, especially during injury isolation. Because injuries reduce life suddenly to essentials: patience, pain, waiting. Healing rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Most recovery unfolds through repetition, almost boring in its consistency. Controlled exercises, stretching, monitoring progress measured in tiny improvements invisible to outsiders. Entire weeks can pass with little visible change, yet internally athletes feel every slight difference immediately. Neymar often trained alone during early rehabilitation sessions, while teammates prepared for matches elsewhere. Huge facilities that normally felt energetic became strangely empty during those hours. Echoes from footsteps travelled through corridors lined with club photographs celebrating victories and trophies. Staff members spoke softly nearby while machines hummed steadily beneath bright lights. The silence inside training centres before sunrise can feel almost sacred, a different world entirely from match-day chaos. And in those quiet spaces, athletes sometimes confront themselves more honestly than anywhere else, without crowds, without performance, without applause protecting them from thought. Neymar occasionally stayed longer than required after sessions, moving slowly through exercises while music played through headphones. Not because he lacked discipline, but because recovery creates restless energy difficult to settle. The body wants to return faster than healing allows. The mind imagines movement before it becomes safe again. Athletes spend careers trusting instinct. Rehabilitation demands caution instead. That conflict can become emotionally exhausting. Outside, Paris continued through winter normally. Fashion shows, tourists, traffic crossing wet streets beneath glowing cafes and cold evening lights. The city itself remained beautiful even in grey weather. But beauty observed from isolation sometimes sharpens loneliness rather than softening it. At night, Neymar sometimes stood quietly near windows overlooking the skyline while distant sirens moved faintly across the city below. His reflection appeared dimly against the glass, older now than the boy from Santos, wealthier than he once could have imagined, more famous than almost any footballer on earth. Yet fame does not prevent vulnerable moments from arriving. If anything, visibility can make vulnerability feel more dangerous, because millions watch for signs of weakness constantly. Perhaps that was why true rest remained difficult. Even during silence, expectation lingered nearby. Recovery timelines, career questions, public judgment waiting patiently for return performances. Football never fully releases its hold on athletes psychologically. The game follows them into sleep, into conversations, into empty rooms long after stadium lights shut down, especially for players whose lives became symbols of entertainment and national pride simultaneously. And still, despite everything, Neymar kept returning to the field after injuries because something deeper than fame connected him to football itself. Not the business, not the headlines, the feeling, the movement, the brief moments during matches when instinct takes over completely, and the noise around the world disappears beneath concentration and rhythm. Those moments remained worth chasing, even through pain, even through exhaustion, even through sleepless Paris nights where rain touched windows softly while the city drifted toward morning outside. By dawn, the apartment had grown pale with early light again. Neymar sat quietly on the edge of a couch with untouched coffee, cooling beside him, while another day prepared to begin. Soon, there would be schedules and treatment and messages requiring replies. the machinery of modern football life would resume its endless motion. But for now, silence still belonged to the room, and within that silence lingered the quiet understanding that healing was never only about the body. Some recoveries unfolded much deeper than muscles or bones, hidden beneath public attention in places no cameras could fully reach. There are certain hotel rooms that begin to feel almost temporary before someone even enters them. The lighting is always soft in the same careful way. Curtains remain half closed against unfamiliar city skylines. Suitcases rest near walls without fully unpacking, because departure will arrive too soon to justify permanence. Air conditioning hums quietly through the night while televisions glow silently in empty corners. And somewhere beyond thick windows, another city continues living its ordinary life, completely separate from the athletes sleeping above it. For Neymar, years of football gradually blurred into sequences of airports, hotels, tunnels, and stadiums spread across continents. Luxury surrounded nearly every part of it. But luxury and rest are not always the same thing. By then, his life moved with enormous speed. Paris 1 week, Brazil the next, international duty, commercial appearances, recovery sessions, flights crossing oceans while phone screens illuminated endlessly with messages waiting before the plane even landed. The body travelled faster than the mind sometimes could, and because of that, nights became emotionally important. Not dramatic nights filled with revelation, quiet ones, moments when movement finally stopped long enough for thought to settle. Inside expensive hotel suites before major matches, Neymar sometimes wandered sleeplessly between rooms while teammates rested behind neighbouring walls. Music played softly through headphones, city lights stretched below like reflections scattered across dark water. Ice packs rested against tired muscles, while recovery drinks sat unfinished on polished tables. The world outside imagined glamour. And yes, glamour existed. Designer clothing folded neatly across chairs, watches worth more than childhood homes, views overlooking famous skylines, invitations into spaces most people only see online or in magazines. Fame had opened every possible door around him, but human exhaustion passes easily through luxury. That never changes completely, especially for athletes whose schedules allow almost no true stillness. At some point during those years, Neymar's life had become divided between two entirely different realities existing simultaneously. One reality belonged to the public: goals, celebrations, headlines, transfer rumours, interviews, trophies, social media clips watched millions of times. The other reality unfolded privately in quieter fragments invisible to most people. Late-night stretching sessions after difficult matches, phone calls home while sitting alone beside hotel windows, recovery treatments beneath fluorescent lights, silent mornings where the body felt heavier than expected after years of impact accumulating gradually. Public life looked bright. Private life often looked tired, and perhaps fatigue itself changes people slowly. Not only physical fatigue, emotional fatigue from permanent observation. By then, Neymar had spent much of his adult life being watched continuously. Cameras followed arrivals, departures, celebrations, frustrations, injuries, relationships, vacations, hairstyles, clothing choices. Almost every visible detail became material for discussion somewhere online. At first, attention can feel exciting. Eventually it becomes environmental, like weather, always present whether welcomed or not. That level of visibility creates strange distance between famous people and ordinary life. Small experiences most humans barely notice become difficult or impossible. Walking anonymously through a city at night, sitting quietly in a cafe without attracting phones and whispers, existing publicly without performance attached somehow to the moment. For Neymar, the separation from normality had happened gradually enough that perhaps he rarely thought about it consciously anymore. Yet certain nights still revealed the weight of it quietly, especially while travelling. Hotels can feel strangely isolating even when surrounded by teammates, because nothing inside them truly belongs to the person staying there. The furniture is temporary, the artwork generic, the silence unfamiliar. Athletes learn to recreate routines inside those spaces to protect some sense of stability. Music, specific foods, stretching habits, conversations with family before sleep, small rituals against constant movement. Back in Brazil, meanwhile, life continued through entirely different rhythms. Family gatherings remained loud and warm. Friends still spoke over one another during meals while music drifted through open rooms. Children played football outside beneath humid evening skies, exactly as Neymar once had himself. The simplicity of those scenes lingered in his memory, partly because they belonged to a period untouched by worldwide expectation. Childhood rarely understands how valuable anonymity truly is. Only distance reveals that. During quieter moments, Neymar sometimes missed not only Brazil itself, but the emotional freedom attached to earlier versions of life there. Back then, mistakes disappeared quickly. Matches ended without becoming international debate. Personal moments remained personal. Success had given him extraordinary things, but it had also enlarged every difficulty beyond normal proportion. And still, the world expected brightness constantly from stars. Confidence, energy, performance. Public emotion operates strangely around famous athletes because supporters often experience them symbolically rather than humanly. Fans project hope, frustration, pride, identity, even national emotion onto players performing beneath enormous lights. When those players struggle publicly, reactions become deeply emotional because audiences feel personally connected to outcomes. Neymar carried those projections everywhere. For Brazil especially, expectations often felt enormous beyond ordinary club pressure. International football changes emotional scale entirely. Nations watch together. Victories become collective celebration. Defeats linger culturally for years afterward. And Brazilian football history itself carries impossible standards shaped by generations of legendary players before him. To wear the national shirt meant carrying memory as well as expectation. The pressure surrounding that responsibility followed him quietly through hotel corridors before international matches. Security teams waited outside entrances. Journalists gathered endlessly in lobbies hoping for reactions or glimpses. Entire countries anticipated performances before kickoff even arrived. Yet inside hotel rooms, life reduced again to smaller scenes. Boots laid carefully beside walls. Messages from family glowing across screens late at night. Recovery socks pulled over tired legs while television channels played silently in the background. And sometimes, long after teammates had fallen asleep, Neymar remained awake listening to unfamiliar city sounds drifting faintly upward from streets below. Perhaps athletes become most aware of loneliness while surrounded by admiration, because admiration itself cannot provide intimacy. Crowds may scream someone's name without knowing who they are privately at all. The older Neymar became, the more visible this contradiction seemed during quiet moments. Publicly, he remained one of the most recognizable athletes on earth. Privately, there were still ordinary human concerns moving beneath the surface. Injury fear, family responsibility, emotional exhaustion, uncertainty about time passing faster each season. Football careers feel endless while young, then suddenly they do not. One day, an athlete realizes recovery takes longer than before. Younger players arrive carrying the same fearless energy once attached to their own name. Conversations about legacy begin appearing more frequently than conversations about potential. The shift happens quietly, and nighttime notices it first. Inside another hotel somewhere in Europe, Neymar once stood alone near the window after midnight watching rain gather beneath streetlights far below. The city remained anonymous from that height, just reflections moving through darkness, while buses crossed intersections and strangers hurried beneath umbrellas toward lives entirely disconnected from football. He stayed there longer than intended, perhaps because windows create distance gentle enough for thought. Athletes spend so much time inside controlled environments: locker rooms, training facilities, press areas, private transportation. Looking outward at ordinary life can feel strangely calming after years surrounded by performance. The applause from earlier matches had already faded. Social media reactions continued somewhere online endlessly, but in that moment, there was only rain, silence, exhaustion, and the faint reflection of his own face against cold glass. Years later in Paris, similar scenes returned repeatedly during sleepless mornings. Different city, different apartment, same underlying stillness after noise disappeared. Neymar sat quietly now, while weak sunlight spread slowly through the room and distant traffic echoed upward between buildings. The football boots near the doorway remained untouched. The phone beside him continued vibrating occasionally with new messages. But for a few moments longer, he ignored everything. Because somewhere beneath the movement and luxury and endless visibility, there remained a quieter version of himself still searching through empty hotel nights and silent city mornings for something the world could not cheer loudly enough to replace. Sometimes the loudest moments in football are followed by the quietest mornings. After enormous matches, entire cities remain awake deep into the night. Car horns echo through crowded streets. Supporters gather outside stadiums long after players have disappeared through secured exits. Television panels continue debating performances until sunrise approaches. Online, millions of reactions multiply endlessly across glowing screens, while highlights replay again and again beneath dramatic music. But eventually the noise always fades, and afterward, athletes return somewhere private where silence waits patiently for them. For Neymar, those mornings often felt strangely detached from the spectacle that came before. Hotel curtains still closed against daylight, room service trays left untouched beside windows, recovery equipment scattered quietly across furniture, compression sleeves, ice packs, taped ankles resting heavily against soft sheets. The body remained exhausted long after adrenaline disappeared. Yet sleep still did not always come easily, perhaps because the mind continued replaying moments from the night before, a missed chance, a perfect pass, the sound of 80,000, people reacting simultaneously beneath stadium lights. Football exists publicly for supporters, but privately it lives inside athletes much longer after matches end. Every movement remains stored somewhere mentally, revisited repeatedly during quiet hours when nobody else can see. Neymar had experienced enough enormous nights by then to understand how temporary football emotion could become. Victories that seemed historic on one evening slowly dissolved into preparation for the next challenge. Criticism that dominated headlines one week disappeared almost entirely the next. Public attention moved quickly, constantly searching for new stories. But internally, certain moments stayed, especially difficult ones. Losses carry different silence afterward. Celebration fills space naturally. Defeat empties it. After painful matches, locker rooms often became almost motionless except for showers, running somewhere in the distance, and staff members speaking softly near doors. Players stared at floors. Phones remained untouched longer than usual. Music disappeared completely. Even famous athletes who spend careers beneath pressure still feel disappointment in deeply human ways once cameras stop recording. Neymar experienced those silences repeatedly throughout his career, with clubs, with Brazil, injuries, finals, World Cups carrying expectations too large for any single person to comfortably hold alone. The world often treats elite athletes as symbols during major tournaments rather than individuals. Nations project collective hope onto players whose private emotional lives continue existing, beneath the surface regardless of public mythology surrounding them. For Brazil especially, football carries emotional intensity difficult to separate from identity itself. Generations grew up worshipping beauty within the sport. Creativity, movement, freedom, improvisation. Brazilian stars inherit not only admiration but memory. The ghosts of earlier greatness remain nearby constantly. And Neymar understood that weight every time he wore the national colours. Some nights before international matches, hotel hallways remained unusually quiet because tension settled naturally over entire squads. Players moved carefully between rooms. Staff members reviewed plans repeatedly. Outside, journalists waited endlessly behind barriers hoping for photographs or reactions before kickoff. Inside his room, Neymar sometimes sat alone listening to music through headphones, while messages from home arrived steadily across his phone. Family wishing luck, friends sending encouragement, old memories drifting unexpectedly through his thoughts. Pressure often makes people remember simpler times, perhaps because simplicity offers emotional shelter against expectation. For Neymar, those memories frequently return to Brazil not as dramatic scenes, but ordinary fragments, afternoon heat rising from concrete, his father watching training sessions carefully from the sidelines, the sound of laughter during street football games stretching past sunset, small apartments filled with conversation and music where life still felt close enough to touch completely. The further fame carried him outward, the more emotionally distant those earlier years sometimes seemed, and yet they remained inside him persistently, especially during vulnerable moments. In Paris, there were evenings when luxury itself began feeling strangely quiet. The apartment overlooking the city remained beautiful in every visible way, expensive furniture arranged perfectly, soft lighting designed carefully to create calm, shelves holding watches, awards, framed photographs from unforgettable matches and celebrations around the world. Yet objects cannot fully answer loneliness. They decorate it beautifully sometimes, but they cannot remove it entirely. Neymar occasionally wandered through those rooms late at night after friends had gone home, and the city outside slowed towards silence. Televisions remained muted. Music played softly somewhere distant inside the apartment. Reflections from Paris drifted across enormous windows while cold rain touched the glass gently. There is a particular kind of solitude that arrives only after years of visibility. Not isolation from people, isolation from normality. Famous athletes are almost never completely alone physically. Staff members, teammates, security, media, supporters. Movement surrounds them constantly, but emotional privacy becomes increasingly difficult because every public version of themselves grows larger than the private one beneath it. And eventually, protecting that private self requires exhaustion of its own. Neymar learned carefully which parts of his life to show and which parts to guard. Social media displayed celebration, travel, friendships, style, laughter. Yet quieter emotions often remained hidden behind carefully controlled visibility. Frustration after injuries, fear before important returns, exhaustion from constant scrutiny. Public life rewards brightness. Private life absorbs everything else. The older he became, the more visible this division sometimes felt during silent nights, especially while recovering from physical setbacks. Injuries had altered the rhythm of his career repeatedly, interrupting momentum during moments where everything seemed aligned perfectly. Recovery periods brought not only pain, but reflection. Time slowed enough for thoughts usually buried beneath travel and competition to surface more clearly. Questions about the future, about how long elite football truly lasts, about what remains afterward when stadium lights no longer define daily existence. Athletes rarely speak openly about these fears while still competing, because confidence forms part of performance itself. The public expects certainty from stars. Vulnerability can become headlines too easily. So many reflections remain private instead. Late-night thoughts beside dark windows, conversations with trusted family members, long silences during flights crossing oceans between matches and obligations. Somewhere deep inside, athletes understand their careers are temporary long before supporters want to admit it. Football moves forward relentlessly. Younger players arrive constantly carrying fresh energy and possibility. Crowds shift attention naturally toward whoever represents the future most brightly. Even legends eventually become memory before becoming history. And perhaps part of Neymar already sensed time moving differently now than during earlier years at Santos or Barcelona. Not ending, just changing. The body remembered more impact than before. Recovery required greater care. Noise surrounding fame no longer felt entirely new or exciting. Certain celebrations became quieter internally because he had already experienced versions of them many times. Yet despite everything, the game itself still held emotional power over him. That never fully disappeared. The feeling before kickoff, the rhythm of dribbling freely past defenders, the roar rising suddenly from crowds after moments of brilliance. Those experiences connected directly back to childhood joy in Brazil before football became industry, business, spectacle, expectation. and perhaps that connection mattered more than anything else now. Back inside the Paris apartment, evening had slowly returned again. Lights from the city shimmered across wet streets, while distant sirens moved somewhere beyond the windows. Neymar sat alone near the couch with his phone resting dark beside him for once. No interviews, no cameras, no movement, only quiet. The room carried the strange stillness that sometimes follows lives lived too publicly for too long. A stillness filled not with sadness exactly, but with reflection difficult to avoid once noise finally disappears. Outside, Paris continued glowing beautifully into the night. Inside, Neymar remained motionless for a while longer, listening to the silence surrounding him, and perhaps wondering, somewhere beneath memory and fame and exhaustion, whether the child who once played freely beneath Brazilian streetlights had ever completely disappeared at all. There were evenings when Neymar avoided turning on the television completely, not because he disliked football, but because football already filled too much of life even in silence. Analysis waited everywhere now, in sports channels playing endlessly inside hotel gyms, in notifications arriving every few minutes, in strangers debating performances online deep into the night. The game followed him constantly, even into spaces meant for rest. So sometimes the apartment remained quiet instead. Only music, only distant city sounds drifting upward through glass windows. Only the faint hum of Paris after midnight. Those nights often felt slower than the world expected someone like him to live. Public imagination prefers famous athletes in motion, celebrations, parties, luxury cars, stadium entrances surrounded by cameras and excitement. But much of real life unfolds privately through still moments invisible to everyone else, sitting alone after long days, thinking quietly while cities sleep outside, walking through empty rooms where no performance is required for a little while. Neymar had spent years surrounded by noise intense enough to reshape ordinary emotional rhythm. Crowds roaring beneath floodlights, media attention expanding after every match, millions of strangers discussing his decisions, injuries, personality, future. Eventually, constant visibility changes how silence feels. At first, quiet can seem peaceful. Later, it can begin revealing things hidden beneath movement. During one particularly cold stretch in Paris, rain fell across the city for days almost without stopping. Streets reflected pale light endlessly, while grey skies settled low above rooftops from morning until evening. Training continued, recovery continued, obligations continued. Yet outside those routines, the city itself seemed wrapped in a kind of exhausted stillness. Neymar often stayed awake later during weather like that. The apartment lights dimmed low while music drifted softly between rooms. Sometimes friends visited briefly. Laughter, conversation, old stories from Brazil shared across late dinners before everyone eventually disappeared back into the night. But afterward, silence always returned. And silence has memory. It remembers childhood. It remembers pain. It remembers earlier versions of people before the world gave them new names. For Neymar, memories of Brazil never disappeared beneath fame, no matter how luxurious life became afterward. Certain details remained emotionally untouched by time. Warm evening air moving through crowded neighborhoods, the sound of football bouncing against concrete, his mother's voice somewhere inside small apartments where rooms felt close together and life felt emotionally near. There is comfort in remembering periods of life untouched by worldwide expectation. Before interviews required caution, before every expression became photographed, before mistakes transformed instantly into headlines shared across continents. The older Neymar became, the more those earlier memories seemed connected not only to childhood, but to freedom itself. Not financial freedom, emotional freedom. The freedom to exist without constant interpretation. In football, public narratives form quickly around players and rarely stay simple. Neymar had been celebrated as joyful genius, criticised as overly emotional, praised for brilliance, questioned for inconsistency, admired for creativity, doubted for discipline, sometimes all within the same month. Millions of people believed they understood him. Very few truly did, because public identity always becomes simplified eventually. Real people never are. Late at night, after matches or treatment sessions or long flights across Europe, Neymar occasionally scrolled through old photographs on his phone instead of sleeping. Family gatherings, friends laughing near beaches in Brazil, younger versions of himself smiling before major finals years earlier, teammates standing together beneath stadium lights after unforgettable victories. Photographs freeze moments beautifully, but they also reveal how quickly life moves. Football careers compress time strangely. Seasons disappear into one another until entire years become remembered only through goals, injuries, transfers, tournaments. Meanwhile, ordinary human life continues quietly underneath. Birthdays missed because of travel, relationships strained by constant movement, parents aging while children become adults, almost unnoticed between competitions. Success enlarges opportunity. It also accelerates everything. Perhaps that acceleration explained part of the exhaustion Neymar sometimes carried during quieter years in Paris. Not physical tiredness alone, a deeper fatigue created through decades spent performing publicly without much pause between expectations. And still, despite all of it, football itself continued calling him back emotionally. Because beneath business and fame and scrutiny, there remained genuine love for the game. Not always for the machinery surrounding it, but for football, for movement, for creativity, for the feeling of improvisation arriving naturally beneath pressure. That feeling connected directly to the child he once had been. Sometimes during training, especially on calmer days without cameras nearby, glimpses of that earlier joy returned clearly. A quick dribble between teammates, laughter during small-sided games, instinct taking over before thought interrupted. In those moments, football became simple again briefly. Just movement and rhythm, nothing else. But simplicity rarely lasted long at professional level. Soon there were meetings again, recovery schedules, tactical discussions, endless public conversations surrounding performances and injuries. The machinery resumed constantly around every elite athlete whether they wanted it to or not. Neymar learned over time how to move through that machinery while protecting certain private spaces internally. Music helped, family helped, close friendships carried over from Brazil helped most of all, because those relationships remembered him before fame transformed daily life completely. People who knew someone before success often become emotionally important afterward. They remember ordinary versions hidden beneath celebrity. An ordinary memory can feel grounding when the world constantly projects larger identities onto a person. There were nights when Neymar sat on balconies overlooking sleeping cities while talking quietly with old friends back home in Brazil. Conversations wandered naturally between football and completely unrelated things. Music, family, childhood stories, jokes repeated too many times already. Those moments mattered because they existed outside performance. No interviews, no expectations, just familiarity. The kind impossible to purchase regardless of wealth. Outside, Paris continued moving through another rain-soaked night. Cars crossed wet intersections below, while reflections trembled across the Seine beneath pale streetlights. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly upward from another apartment, where strangers lived entirely different lives, untouched by stadium pressure or public scrutiny. Neymar watched the city quietly for a long time, perhaps because cities at night remind people how small individual lives actually are despite fame. Millions of windows glowing softly across enormous distances, countless private stories unfolding simultaneously beyond attention. The realization can feel strangely comforting after years spent beneath relentless visibility. Inside the apartment, the air carried faint traces of coffee and rain. Football boots remained near the doorway from training earlier that day. A hoodie rested carelessly over the back of a chair. The room itself looked less like a celebrity photograph now and more like what it truly was, a place where someone tired had come to sit quietly after carrying expectation for too many years without complete rest. And maybe that was the hidden truth lingering beneath so much of Neymar's life. Not the trophies, not the headlines, not even the fame itself. but the ongoing search for moments quiet enough to feel real again, after spending so long inside noise powerful enough to make almost everything else disappear. He remained beside the window while Paris drifted deeper into night around him, and somewhere far away in memory, beneath warm Brazilian skies and distant streetlights, a younger version of himself still moved freely across concrete, chasing a football with no cameras waiting afterward at all. There are moments late at night when even large cities begin to sound distant. Traffic softens first, then conversations fade from nearby streets. Elevators stop moving as often inside tall buildings. The world does not fully become silent, but it loosens somehow, as though millions of people have finally agreed to rest at the same time. And during those hours, thoughts that remain hidden beneath daytime movement often rise quietly into view. Neymar knew those hours well, especially during seasons when injuries, criticism and exhaustion all seemed to arrive together without much space between them. By then, Paris no longer felt unfamiliar to him. He knew the shape of the streets beneath his apartment windows. He recognized the pale winter light reflecting across the Seine during cold mornings. He understood which cafes remained open latest and which parts of the city stayed quietest after midnight. But familiarity is not always the same thing as belonging. Some places hold a person gently, others simply contain them for a while. On sleepless nights, Neymar occasionally walked slowly through the apartment with no real destination in mind. One room into another, kitchen lights glowing softly against marble counters, framed photographs resting along shelves beside awards, collected across years too fast to fully process. The apartment carried evidence of extraordinary success everywhere, yet success itself rarely answered the deeper questions waiting beneath fatigue. Athletes spend much of their lives moving toward achievement, trophies, victories, contracts, recognition. The next level always appears just ahead, but eventually, especially after enough years, the pace of ambition changes emotionally. Not because desire disappears completely, but because the body and mind begin asking quieter things at night. What remains after performance? What part of a person survives beyond applause? The world rarely asks athletes those questions while they are still competing. The world asks for goals instead, for entertainment, for moments dramatic enough to replay endlessly online. And Neymar had provided many of those moments throughout his career. The goals, the celebrations, the impossible movements through defenders that seemed to belong more to instinct than calculation. Millions remembered those images vividly, yet memory inside him worked differently. He remembered exhaustion after matches more clearly sometimes than the matches themselves. The relief of removing boots after 90 difficult minutes, ice against swollen ankles, the strange emptiness inside locker rooms once crowds disappeared completely. Football from the inside feels quieter than football from the outside. There are long stretches of waiting hidden between public moments. Waiting before matches, waiting through recovery, waiting inside hotel rooms while cities roar outside, waiting during flights crossing dark oceans between obligations. And during waiting, athletes often become unusually reflective because movement no longer protects them from thought. For Neymar, reflection increasingly circled around time itself, not dramatically, just quietly. The realization that childhood now existed very far behind him, despite feeling emotionally close during certain nights. The understanding that careers eventually narrow toward endings whether athletes feel prepared or not. The awareness that fame, while powerful, could never fully pause aging or exhaustion. The body keeps count even when the world celebrates. Years of sprinting, years of tackles, years of impact absorbed beneath bright lights while millions watched. Recovery periods had taught him that more clearly than anything else. During injuries, football stripped away illusion quickly. Suddenly the future felt uncertain again no matter how famous someone became. Public opinion shifted rapidly. Younger players filled headlines, questions appeared everywhere about durability, consistency, legacy. And because Neymar had lived so publicly for so long, even vulnerability became spectacle sometimes. Yet vulnerability itself remained deeply human underneath all the attention surrounding it. There were mornings during rehabilitation when simply walking without pain felt significant enough to improve his mood entirely. Small progress mattered privately, even when the public demanded dramatic returns immediately. Stretching exercises completed successfully, confidence returning gradually through movement, the body beginning to trust itself again. Healing changes people slowly, not only physically, emotionally too. It teaches patience unwillingly. It reveals which relationships remain steady when visibility fades temporarily. It creates silence where athletes are forced to confront themselves beyond performance. Perhaps that was why quieter years in Paris seemed emotionally heavier at times than earlier seasons filled purely with excitement and momentum. By then, Neymar understood fame too well to romanticize it completely anymore. He understood its beauty, and its exhaustion. The world saw luxury surrounding him constantly, and luxury was certainly real. Beautiful homes, fashion, travel, experiences unavailable to most people. Success had transformed his life beyond anything childhood streets in Brazil could have predicted. But even beautiful lives contain loneliness sometimes, especially when public identity grows larger than private reality. Neymar often missed simple things in ways difficult to explain publicly without sounding ungrateful. Familiar family noise, friends speaking freely without cameras nearby, places where nobody expected him to represent anything larger than himself for a few hours. Fame turns ordinary freedom into something precious and rare. Outside the apartment, rain had begun again lightly across Paris. Droplets gathered slowly against enormous windows while the city reflected silver beneath streetlights stretching into the distance. Somewhere far below, a siren moved briefly through the night before fading away again. He stood near the glass, watching quietly. There is something strangely intimate about city windows after midnight. Thousands of lives glowing softly behind curtains and apartment walls. Strangers reading, arguing, sleeping, laughing, crying. All hidden from one another despite existing so closely together. Fame isolates people from that anonymity almost completely. Neymar could rarely disappear into ordinary life anymore. Even vacations attracted photographers. Even quiet dinners became news. And over time, permanent visibility teaches a person to remain partially guarded everywhere. That kind of vigilance becomes tiring eventually. Not fear exactly, just awareness. Awareness that someone is always watching, listening, interpreting. Public figures often learn to divide themselves unconsciously between performance and privacy. One version exists outwardly for the world, another survives more quietly beneath it. For athletes especially, maintaining the separation can become emotionally necessary. The outward version of Neymar remained recognizable globally. Confident, stylish, emotional, creative, famous beyond imagination. The inward version looked quieter during nights like this, more reflective, more tired perhaps than the world fully understood. And yet somewhere underneath all the exhaustion, football still mattered deeply to him. Not because of money anymore, not even because of fame, because the game itself still carried emotional truth connected to childhood, movement without overthinking, joy arriving suddenly through instinct, the brief feeling during perfect moments that nothing else in the world existed except rhythm and freedom. Those feelings cannot be manufactured artificially. Athletes spend entire careers chasing them again and again. Sometimes they appear beneath stadium lights before roaring crowds. Sometimes only during small training sessions where cameras are absent entirely. Either way, the feeling remains powerful enough to pull players through pain, scrutiny, travel, and sleepless nights year after year. Neymar remained by the window while rain traced slow paths down the glass beside his reflection. The apartment around him stayed silent now except for distant music playing faintly somewhere in another room. Morning would arrive eventually. Another day of schedules and obligations would begin. The machinery of football would continue moving forward exactly as always. But for now, there was only quiet. And within that quiet lingered the soft, unresolved feeling that perhaps the most important parts of his life had never truly belonged to stadiums or headlines at all, but to the smaller invisible moments the world would never fully see.